they say one of the reasons that Trump wanted to do that is because they thought that Biden would, if he got mixed up, he'd get flustered and wouldn't know what to do. And so, the speech impediment. Yeah. So yeah. There's different things where they're saying, yeah, I get this and that. Well, I mean, he says he doesn't, but yeah, people who don't like him say he does. So I mean, he has had brain surgery. He's had pretty extensive brain surgery. He said they had to take the top of his skull off. Just go in and, yeah, that's. See, I could never be a brain surgeon because I just throw up. They need to have barbers. Just, that's not going to help. Oh wait, the video started. Hey folks, it is October the 1st, and we're going to start our lecture on World War I. So please keep in mind that the lecture notes and the slides we're going over are in Google Classroom, so you want to follow along as we go, because what I'm talking about, they see on the projector, but you can't see the projector. So you want to pull it up on your own device. All right, kids. But I should probably open it. Here it is. Yeah, good old brain surgery. Let's see. Whew. Now, here's the thing. Make sure you try to follow along carefully, but don't worry too much about it if you don't get it at first. I'm going to show you some stuff on World War I later that'll hopefully make more sense to you. But World War I has a very complex beginning. There's a couple of different reasons why World War I is going to begin. If you want to step back and think about it from an ancient historical perspective, like who's had me in ninth grade?
What?
Who's had me in ninth grade as your ninth grade history teacher? We're talking about ancient Greece and Rome. So when we were talking about ancient Greece, there was a big civil war in Greece that had to do with Athens and Sparta. And one of the main reasons they got into this war was Athens got so big and powerful and had such huge alliance of allies, Sparta felt like they had to go to war with them to stop them before they got too big and swallowed them up. There's something similar that's going to happen here with Europe. It's called the Thucydides trap, because the person who wrote about this was an ancient Greek historian named Thucydides. And so we're going to see this trap is almost going to explode as well during the Cold War when we talk about Soviet Russia and America later on, where you have two powerful entities fearful that they might have to go with a war with their opponent so they don't get caught first. So this picture here, these are going to be, this is going to be the tipping point for World War I, is the assassination of these two individuals. In Europe during this time, a lot of countries still had crowned princes and kings and queens. One country, which is still around today, called Austria, still had parts of its empire. A couple of parts of its empire was a country called Hungary and another called Serbia. The country Serbia wanted to have its own country and to be free from Austrian control. And because of that, it's going to have certain radical elements influenced by anarchism, which we talked about before, which did a lot of acts of terrorism. We're going to see how this guy here, he's going to be the crown prince of Austria, and who is the next in line to be in charge of all of that area. Him and his wife, Sophie, will be assassinated by some young anarchists who also want their country free from their control. Unfortunately, this is going to be too much for Austria. It's going to make a lot of big demands of Serbia. Serbia is going to say that's too much, and then others are going to get involved. Next thing you know, half the world's going to be at war. It's a little complicated, but It all goes way back even further than that. So, Europe had long enjoyed a balance of power, which was largely upset by the unification of Germany as a new and powerful nation. Germany was aggressively seeking to become a first world power, an empire like other European nations. So, after the American Revolution, um, our allies in France had problems, and then they had their own revolution. It got so chaotic and so radical that the rest of Europe went to war with them. Out of that chaos emerged a guy called Napoleon, powerful, powerful general. He conquered almost all of his neighbors. Eventually, he's going to be defeated at the Battle of Waterloo by the British. And then the rest of Europe's going to get together and they're going to make agreements and divide up the empires of the world to where they could control it, but there'd be a balance of power to prevent another great war like that. When they made these agreements and these alliances, though, the country of Germany didn't exist yet. It was a bunch of small, separate kingdoms and principalities. When the German people do unite and make their own country, it's going to greatly upset that balance of power. The old agreements didn't have them in it, but they want to be a great power. So they start doing things like other European powers. They make a massive military. They they advance themselves in sciences and culture, especially philosophy, but also military. During this time period, 90% of all military manuals will be made by Germans. They're going to be the cutting edge of warfighting. The rest of Europe's going to be very scared of this. So they're also, in order to prevent a war or from Germany becoming too powerful, Britain, France, and Russia will make a defensive pact called the Triple Entente. It's French for an agreement. They're going to make an agreement that if you go to war, I will help you. If someone attacks you, I will defend you. In response to that, Germany is going to get its friends, Austria Hungary, and Italy, and they're going to form their own defensive alliance called the Triple Alliance. So the Entente versus the Alliance. They're building up their militaries. They're drumming up support from their civilians. During this time period, governments will constantly threaten war on one another. Young men really, really want to join the military and go beat up their neighbors. It's like a time we call hyper nationalism. A lot of cultures are going to become very militaristic. Like in Germany, for example, a young man was expected to join the service. When he went to college, he spent his pastime learning how to fight and shoot. Before young men graduated college, one of the traditions was him and his buddies would get together and they would take a saber. It's a long curved sword used for horseback fighting. And they basically played chicken with it. And so your friend would take the sword and thwack you like as hard as he could in the face. And if you didn't flinch, everybody would applaud you and call you brave. And so most young men graduating from college had like a big like gash scar across their face from getting whacked. They call it sabering. So it was just kind of like just a symptom of this tough warlike manhood that was around. Both groups built up militaries, planned for war, and swore to defend the members of their alliance despite those whoever was at fault. Prior to World War I, Austria was in possession of this little Eastern European country called Serbia. The Serbians will basically never be at peace. They're going to have a lot of problems later on, we'll see. A country that held more in common with Russia and had leanings towards independence. So Austria is in charge of it. Austrians speak German. They are mostly Protestant Christians, and they have a completely separate history from the Serbians. Serbians speak a language that's more in common with Russian. Their culture is more like the Russians. They even write with the same alphabet as Russians, Cyrillic. They go to the same church as Russians, Eastern Orthodox. and their history is more in line with them. So the Russians didn't like this very much. The Serbians wanted independence. And Russia historically has called itself the defenders of the Slavic people. And Slavic people it's not a race, it's like a linguistic group. Kind of like Americans are Anglophones. We speak English just like Australia, Canada, stuff like that. So we usually have a lot in common. Um, or you could say Semitic people in the Middle East all speak Semitic languages. Serbians spoke Slavic languages. So they, there's culture, the culture's tied. All these things are building up though. So people are upset. But everybody knows something's going to happen. It's like they see it for years. Everybody knows there's going to be a big war. The whole foolish part of it is everybody thought they were going to win, and it would only be a couple of weeks. It's not going to be a couple of weeks. People thought the same thing with the U.S. Civil War. Both sides thought it was going to be just a few days out. You'd hurt the other side, you have a picnic, and come home for a parade. It wasn't like that. Now, hey, remember, don't write down everything. Just try to make sure that you're getting down key points that will help you remember. But I mean, I didn't get you textbooks or anything like that. So this is our information. If you ever get lost or something like that, you can always pull this stuff up on Google Classroom. And you can always go to Google Classroom to find my lectures. So, and if you really wanted to, you can also watch the dual credit ones, but I use the same slides. I just give them extra readings and stuff like that. So for rigor, like I'm ordering some books, and we're supposed to use the TJC books and all that stuff. You ready to move on?
Yes.
All right, so this is a photograph of some of the early warfare that we're going to see. These are actually German troops. The Allies are going to call them the Huns, because way back in the time of Charlemagne, you would have the Huns and the Avars would be part of the Eastern Gaul, right? So way back then. So it's like a derogatory term. Of course, they'd also call them Krauts, which, because they eat sauerkraut. But you see, they have these imperial helms, the little spike on top. This is going to be a major war where technology, especially in industry, is going to be a deciding factor. All of a sudden, unlike days before, every soldier is going to have long-range, accurate rifles. Artillery, which is big cannons, is going to be very accurate. They're going to be able to use this fire in an explosive way all throughout the war. Machine guns are going to totally change the face of warfare. Some countries, such as I think Belgium, still had what we call mounted cavalry. That's guys riding on horsebacks with lances, with big spears. And they thought that they could actually charge in, like days of old, into these forces. Well, the machine gun's going to end that. It's going to end it in less than a week. And you will never again see horses used in cavalry charges in this manner. So it's going to be where you're just going to have a whole bunch of changes. So Austria, I'm missing this from my notes for some reason, but so the Archduke Ferdinand, he's going to make a visit to Serbia to try to smooth things over. He's supposed to be the guy next in line for the crown. As he goes in, though, a group of radical anarchists are going to plan his assassination. Some of them are going to get cold feet when he's riding around, kind of like in a parade. They're going to throw bombs at his car, but he's going to survive that and manage to drive away. Later on, though, one of them is going to find him, and with a pistol is going to murder his wife and him. This is going to make Austria super mad. They are going to make demands on the little country of Serbia that are so strict, it's basically going to end all forms of independence for that country. So they are going to say, we cannot do that. They're going to and bless you, Austria says they're going to do this because they want to investigate the crime, they want to prevent it from happening again, and they blame the Serbian people and government in general for it happening. Russia is going to say, you cannot do that. If you do that, you're going to destroy a friendly country. And so the Russians will then mobilize their entire military forces along the border of Austria and Germany. In response to this, Germany is going to do something called the Schlieffen Plan, or the Schlieffen Plan. So this German general is going to come up with a plan to where, remember, you have these alliances, you have this Entente. Germany knows that if they go to war, their best chance for success is to attack first and attack quickly. And they know if they're going to fight Russia, they're also going to fight Russia's friends, England and France. So their idea was to make it to France and knock it out as fast as possible, hold off Russia, and by doing so, England wouldn't have a way to join in. And so to do this, however, Germany would have to break international law. There's a neutral country called Belgium. The Germans will cut through the Belgian territory and then invade France. The Germans had already invaded and took Paris before, not that long before this. They thought it would be an easy task. However, the Belgian people will manage to make a defensive line and hold them off long enough for the French and British to get ready to stop them. Then Germany is going to be caught fighting two armies on its west and another army on its east. Battle lines were quickly entrenched in order to protect troops from deadly artillery and machine gun fire. During the U.S. Civil War, Germany would send in its best generals to come watch years before this, all the way back in the 1860s, to see how Americans killed each other. They learned a lot on the use of trenches in the American Civil War and battles like Spotsylvania and stuff like that. Americans would dig in these huge trenches to prevent themselves from dying. And it turned into a form of warfare that they saw was very effective, but it's very hard to do. But they essentially had to do this because you can't have big lines of Civil War soldiers marching into machine gun fire. Those lines of men will turn into hamburger meat. It doesn't work out that well. And so when you're underneath walls of earth, you're safe from those projectiles. The artillery is going to be really bad too. These aren't going to be cannonballs anymore. They're going to use rifled tubes set on suspension that allows them to fire artillery shells that can explode and cause a massive amount of damage like never before. They're also going to start using things like poisonous gas, often scentless, so that you don't know that you need to put on your gas mask until you see the people around you starting to choke. And usually then it's too late. This would often blind men for the rest of their lives, blister their skin, have them cough up blood. It's like horrible stuff. The spaces between these trenches were known as no man's land. This is known as, like, a lot of historians say this is like the ugliest war. Men were often stuck in these trenches. They stuck their head up to go take a look at the enemy. The sniper would shoot them. The trenches would fill up with water, and the water on your skin for long periods of time could cause very deadly infections, gangrene, trench foot, cholera, which is essentially bacterial poisoning in water. That can, like you've seen a video on cholera, can cause massive amounts of problems. You essentially die of diarrhea. Just lots and lots of problems. Very, very depressing. Very depressing war. So, but that's Europe. Remember, there's one thing you study about Europe. They're pretty much at war most of the time. So, you ready to move on?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, this is America. Like, yeah, peace. Like, not all Americans wanted to get involved in this. If you remember way back from your U.S. history of early America, like, think about, like, George Washington, our first president's farewell address when he left the presidency, he urged Americans to not get into entangling alliances. Well, guess what? Europe was in these alliances, and now all of a sudden, Europeans were all at war, a world war, because they were all buddied up in their gangs, and then they got to a fight. This is what George Washington warned against, because people like him knew what people like the ancient Greeks did, and other places after that. That's why you want leaders to know a little bit about history, right? So a lot of Americans said, we don't want to get involved in this, but some Americans wanted to. And we, of course, spoiler alert, America gets involved. All right, so the United States had mixed feelings about who was right or wrong in the war. Much of this division had to do with ancestry. Most Americans still trace their heritage at this time back to England, and many still remembered French aid to Americans during the American Revolution. Like, so it felt like a bit of indebtedness to the French and the British for helping us out. Now, no, people didn't really have that much affection for Russians at the time, but since they were allied with them, I guess they got a little extra. However, around 10% of Americans were from German stock, and many Irish immigrants despised the British. So that's a good chunk of America right there. And people tend to, even if they're like a generation or two removed, they tend to look fondly on where their ancestors came from, right? And the Irish despised the British because, well, I mean, there's a long history there. Um, you have to think some of the first plantations where you literally had slavery was of Irish people in Ireland by the British. A lot of the Irish who came to America was to escape the potato famine that was made worse by the British because the British wouldn't even allow the Irish to have food imported. Some British people thought it would be better if they just starved to death. So yeah, a lot of Irish people didn't like England. The president at this time, if you remember, Rebecca, you okay? Okay. Woodrow Wilson and his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, shared most of the nation's sentiment for neutrality and isolationism. So that guy, William Jennings Bryan, he's also he's a very religious man. If you study American history, he comes up quite a bit in this period. He was a big guy as far as like the farmers branch of the South, the Populist Party. But he's also going to be not so much an isolationist as in you would think of as a pacifist. And a pacifist is somebody who doesn't want to go to war. Like, no war, just peace at all cost. And so he's advising Woodrow Wilson to stay out of this. Many Democrats saw involvement in the war as an extension of Republican expansionism. So if you remember, those Republican presidents like Taft, McKinley, Roosevelt, they expanded American influence overseas into the Philippines and Hawaii and Cuba and a lot of South America and Asia. Well, they didn't like that very much. They said that that was a Republican expansion, things like colonialism and imperialism, and they didn't think we should get involved with that. They thought that World War I would just be another example of it. Wilson wished to wait out the war as long as possible and proclaimed his idea for something we're going to talk more about later, the League of Nations. It's kind of like the modern day idea of the United Nations and freedom of the seas. Freedom of the seas means anybody can sail in the ocean and trade, right? It's kind of like free international trade. And of course, the expansion of democracy throughout the world. So Wilson is known as being an idealist. He has plans where he believes can cause or help promote world peace. And so the last thing he wants to do is get involved with a war that's not very peaceful. I mean, war is like diametrically opposed to peace. One thing to keep in mind, though, is like, yeah, I mentioned French Revolution, Napoleon, Germany is going to crop up. All of these things are like a chain of events. It's going to lead to World War One. Well, guess what? That war is going to lead to World War Two and the Cold War. And then those things are going to lead to other events. So there's always like, you can't really say that things just happen out of the middle of nowhere. They all have a cause and then they have an effect. So hopefully, hopefully what I show you later will help make more sense of this. So.
Why is it quiet?
I don't know. I was wondering that too. It's been quiet all day. My first two classes I gave quizzes to, and then I had them do study halls. So they were super quiet. Last period wasn't that quiet. I know, right? I keep thinking y'all are just like plotting something wrong. Yeah. It'll be good when he comes back, but he'll come back. He'll come back. You okay? Your leg fell. Oh gosh. Yeah. Sorry, Charlie. All right. Hey, let's do a little bit more. You ready to move on? All right. So the big point here is that a lot of Americans didn't want to go to war, but they still kind of wanted to help out the Entente. But it won't last like that forever. So this is a painting of a British boat called the Lusitania. If you remember the Spanish-American War, a lot of what kicked off that war was a boat sank. Well, guess what? This is going to be a big part of why we will get involved with the war as well. So the Lusitania was a British boat, and it was sailing out in the ocean. It had a lot of civilians on it, and many of those civilians were Americans. It's going to be attacked, however, by an early German submarine called a U-boat. U for like underwater. The Germans said they did it because the boat was carrying weapons that was going to bring to fight them. It's understandable, justifiable reason to shoot down a boat. However, it was full of civilians and it killed many neutral civilians who were Americans. So they made a big boo-boo there. And U-boats would have to attack unannounced. They would sneak up and shoot a missile, underwater missile, we call it torpedo. But they're easy to destroy. So they had to do so secretly. And so the only way they can really identify a target very well is to expose themselves. And so the U-boat is kind of shooting at targets can't identify that well. And so it's a dangerous game. So, but it's fighting dirty. All right. So though the U.S. did not commit its forces to the war, it did become a lending nation as its businesses made loans to the belligerents in Europe. We're going to get involved in the War of 1812 a lot like this as well, and where we try to profit off of other people's wars by selling things to one side or the other. We're going to do this in World War II as well before we get involved. But it doesn't always last. Sometimes you get dragged in. Though this lending greatly boosted the U.S. economy, the loans greatly favored England and France. In 1915, the Lusitania, a British ocean liner, was sunk by German U-boats. 1,198 of the 1,959 people aboard were killed. 128 of those dead were Americans. President Wilson will be very angered about this. A lot of Americans all of a sudden are going to call for war with Germany because you surprise attacked a civilian boat and you killed a bunch of Americans. America's going to be very upset about this. And we're already favoring England anyways. So Wilson called for Germany to end their unrestricted U-boat warfare. However, and he threatened the United States would call for war if they didn't. William Jennings Bryan will resign as Secretary of State because of this, however. And you're going to have others later, guys like Eugene Debs are going to protest this. I'm going to probably talk about that later. During this time, Congress approved the doubling of the U.S. military in preparation for war. Guess what? We're going to do the same thing before we get involved in World War II as well. We're going to see the writing on the wall. We're trying to help out our friends without getting involved in the war. And we're like, we're probably going to get sucked up into this. So we start increasing the amount of troops and stuff like that, just in case we did, but we do. So during this time period, the U.S. military kept some guys full-time for like, they're still for the threat in case they had to use them for Indian fighting. Remember, they had some troops who were trying to catch guys like Pancho Villa and stuff like that. Some were doing police actions and things. But most of the military was very small. And they were guys who were kept on hand to maintain supplies, bases, and to be there to train the newbies when they got called in. So they're starting to activate those guys to train more soldiers. Now, it hasn't been like that a long time. We haven't done that since before World War II. Nowadays, we keep a substantial amount of part-time troops in the National Guards and in the Army, like in the reserves. We also keep a lot of full-timers as well. So we use a different model nowadays than back then. I think we'll do one more and we're going to call it a day. You ready? I'll check that in a minute. All right. All right, last one for the day. Here we have a picture of Woodrow Wilson reading Declaration for War. So now remember in the Constitution, Congress has to vote for a war. So at least that's how it was originally written down. We've kind of expanded the executive power since then, but more on that later as we get more towards modern day American history. So though Germany pledged to end U-boat warfare, they said, okay, Wilson, okay. We'll call our jets if you cool your jets. They're still going to use war U-boats, but they say they're going to give the boats a chance to surrender so that they can search them, to let them go or blow them up. We're going to see U-boats are going to be used again later. So tensions were still high in America. In 1917, a correspondence between Germany and Mexico came to public known as the Zimmermann Telegraph. During this time, They had telegraph wires, which are like phone wires, underwater going from Europe all the way to America. So these big, thick copper cables going all the way to the bottom of the ocean across the Atlantic. Well, they're easy to kind of like as the messages come in, they might be coded, but they're kind of easy to capture and then decode. Well, we capture one of these, which had remember, once again, this is something that happened before the Spanish American War. We caught another telegraph then. Well, Germany was offering Mexico all the lands lost from the Mexican American War, such as Texas and New Mexico and California and stuff like that, if they would invade the United States. Because they were afraid we were going to get involved. They were like, America's already threatening to go to war over having their people killed, so we can strike them first. Mexico's going to say, no, thank you. They also encouraged Japan to attack the United States as well, in places such as the Philippines and stuff like that, in order to distract us from Europe. Guess what? They'll do that later, but not now. Once again, Japan's going to say, no, thank you. So Americans are going to find out about this. It's going to hit the newspapers, and they're going to be really mad. When you find out that a country is trying to talk another country into invading your country, you don't take that lightly. That's it's dangerous. Like, if somebody convinced our neighbors to attack us and kill us, that is provocation for war. You don't accept that. Like, if the guy down the street convinces your neighbor to attack you, the guy down your street's just as guilty. So, I mean, it's bad. So in 1917, Congress approved U.S. entry into war. So that's when the United States gets involved. 1917. You might want to remember that year. 1917, U.S. enters World War I. Fortunately for us, we get in the war at the very end of it. So, yay, America. All right. Wilson advertised this as the last war of the world. And as a chance to apply his progressive principles worldwide. So, now we talked about progressivism, had this whole thing about spreading the ideas of like democracy and caring for all people and things like that in kind of like a missionary aspect. So yeah, we're going to see how Wilson's going to try to make this the last war with his ideas later. We'll probably get to that next week. So yeah, as we come in tomorrow, we'll talk a little bit about some of the fighting, the United States getting ready, going overseas, and all of that good stuff. So, yeah, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, those are kind of like, especially the Cold War, that's a big unit that covers a lot of, it's like the closer you get to modern times, the more we talk about details in a way. Hey, folks, if you're joining us online, that's going to do it for today's lecture. We will meet again, tomorrow, future, and all that good stuff. All right. See you later.